What happens when the most feared warrior race in the galaxy discovers that their greatest enemy isn't another species wielding advanced weapons or psychic powers, but a single human who refuses to back down? For centuries, the Zephyrian Empire has conquered star systems with brutal efficiency, their crystalline warriors cutting through defenses like paper. They've never encountered a species that could match their physical superiority or tactical brilliance. When they arrange a political marriage between their greatest general's daughter and a human diplomat, they expect to add Earth to their collection of subjugated worlds without firing a shot. But Zarathul never anticipated that her quiet, seemingly weak human husband would possess something far more dangerous than any weapon in the galaxy, the unbreakable will of humanity and the lengths a human will go to protect those they love. This is the story of how one human changed the course of galactic history, not through conquest or technology, but through something the Zephyrians had forgotten existed: genuine courage born from love, and the terrifying realization that humans don't just fight to win. They fight to save others, even when victory seems impossible. Prepare yourself for a tale that will redefine what it means to be strong, and why the galaxy learned to fear not the roar of human weapons, but the quiet determination in a human's eyes when everything they cherish is threatened. The crystalline towers of HFY Prime stretched toward the twin suns like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the harsh light across the capital city below. From her balcony high in the imperial spire, Zarathul watched the preparation for what her people called the submission ceremony with growing unease. Below, thousands of Zephyrian citizens had gathered in the great plaza, their translucent skin shimmering with anticipation and barely contained aggression. Zarathul touched the intricate battle scars that decorated her arms, each one a testament to conquered worlds. As the daughter of General Kethvar, the most feared military leader in the Empire, she had earned these marks through blood and victory. Her crystalline skin was harder than most metals known to the galaxy, her strength capable of crushing steel with her bare hands. She had led the assault on the Miran colonies, overseen the subjugation of the Velkan resistance, and watched a dozen species kneel before Zephyrian might. Yet today, she was expected to play the role of a bride. "The human delegation has arrived," announced her aide, Veltar, stepping onto the balcony with characteristic military precision. His own battle scars gleamed in the sunlight, and his expression carried the same disdain that most Zephyrians held for weaker species. "They await your presence in the ceremonial chamber." Zarathul nodded slowly, though her gaze remained fixed on the crowd below. She had read the intelligence reports about Earth and its inhabitants countless times. Humans were a young species, barely having achieved interstellar travel a century ago. Their technology was primitive compared to Zephyrian crystal fusion reactors and biometal alloys. Their bodies were soft, their bones fragile, their lifespans laughably short. The strategic value of their homeworld was minimal: a few rare minerals and a convenient location for staging future conquests into the outer spiral arms. The marriage was simply the most efficient path to absorption. Rather than waste resources on a full military campaign, the Empire would gain control through diplomacy. Once the human diplomat was wed to Zarathul, Earth would become a protectorate, and, within a generation, it would be just another subjugated world providing resources and labor to the Empire. "Tell me again about this human I'm to marry," Zarathul said, finally, turning from the balcony. Veltar consulted his data tablet, though they both knew he had memorized every detail. Marcus Chen, age 32 Earth years. Diplomatic Corps, specializing in interspecies relations. No military background, no notable physical achievements. Standard human psychological profile: emotional, irrational decision-making processes, prone to attachment disorders. And his appearance? Typical human characteristics. Short by our standards, approximately 6.5 feet. Brown hair, brown eyes. Unremarkable muscle mass. The medical scans indicate normal human physiology: internal skeleton, liquid-based circulatory system, carbon-based cellular structure. Veltar paused, his expression showing mild disgust. "He will require environmental adjustments to survive in our atmosphere long-term." Zarathul almost smiled at her aide's revulsion. She had seen humans before, of course, in holographic records and surveillance footage. They looked so much like children compared to the 8-foot average height of Zephyrian adults. Their skin was impossibly soft and vulnerable, lacking any natural armor or protective crystalline structure. Most disturbing to Zephyrian sensibilities was their emotional expressiveness. Humans displayed their feelings openly, a sign of weakness that made most of her people uncomfortable. "The marriage contract specifies that he will live here, on Zephyr Prime?" she asked. "Correct. As per standard absorption protocols, he will be integrated into Zephyrian society while serving as an ambassador for his species. His children will be raised according to imperial standards." Veltar's tone suggested he found the concept of half-human offspring distasteful. Zarathal walked back into her chambers, past walls decorated with weapons from a dozen conquered worlds. Each piece told a story of victory, of another species that had underestimated Zephyrian superiority. Her personal collection included a Corvan plasma blade that could cut through starship hulls, a Nexian gravity hammer that could flatten armored vehicles, and a Draconi neural disruptor that could paralyze an opponent's nervous system. All had belonged to champions who believed they could stand against the Empire. All had been wrong. She paused before a mirror made from polished viridian crystal, studying her reflection. At 7 feet and 8 inches tall, she was considered petite by Zephyrian standards, though her lithe frame concealed strength that could bend titanium. Her crystalline skin had a pale blue tint, and her silver hair fell in long, straight lines past her shoulders. Her eyes were the deep purple that marked her as military nobility, and the angular features of her face had been shaped by generations of selective breeding for optimal warrior genetics. This human would see her and probably think her beautiful, as most soft-skinned species found Zephyrian features attractive. He would not understand that every aspect of her appearance had been designed for war, that her elegant fingers could crush his windpipe before he could react, that her graceful movements were the result of a lifetime of combat training that began before she could walk. "The ceremony begins in 1 hour, Veltar reminded her. "Shall I summon the preparation attendants?" "No," Zarathal said, still staring at her reflection. "I will prepare myself." "Have you arranged the security details we discussed?" "Of course. 3 full security teams will monitor the human at all times. Neural suppressors have been installed in his quarters to prevent any attempt at communication with Earth without authorization. His food will be tested for toxins, though I doubt his primitive species possesses anything that could threaten Zephyrian physiology." Zarathal nodded absently. The security measures were standard for any foreign dignitary, though in Marcus Chen's case, they seemed almost comically excessive. What threat could one human possibly pose to the most powerful military force in the galaxy? She began changing into her ceremonial armor, each piece a work of art forged from the rarest metals. The breastplate bore the crest of her family line, 3 interlinked crystals representing strength, honor, and conquest. The arm guards were inscribed with the names of worlds she had personally brought under imperial control. The ceremonial blade at her hip had been quenched in the blood of a Corvan battle king who had challenged her to single combat. As she sealed the final clasps, Zarathal reflected on the absurdity of the situation. She was a general who had commanded fleets of crystal dreadnoughts and led armies of the most formidable warriors in the galaxy. She had personally killed champions from a dozen species, each believing they represented the pinnacle of their race's fighting ability. Her tactical genius had broken sieges that had lasted centuries and shattered defensive lines thought to be impregnable. And now she was dressing for a wedding to a diplomat from a species that probably couldn't survive 5 minutes in personal combat with even a Zephyrian civilian. The irony was not lost on her that this marriage represented a different kind of conquest. Rather than taking Earth through force of arms, they would claim it through political maneuvering and cultural assimilation. It was, her father had explained, a more elegant solution. More efficient. The humans would become willing participants in their own subjugation, grateful for the protection and technological advancement that Imperial membership provided. Veltar returned to escort her to the ceremonial chamber, his expression as stoic as ever. As they walked through the corridors of the Imperial Spire, passing guards who stood at attention with military precision, Zarathal found herself wondering what this Marcus Chen would be like in person. Would he be frightened? Awed by Zephyrian architecture and technology? Would he stammer and stutter in the presence of beings so obviously superior to his own kind? Most aliens did. The ceremonial chamber was a vast space with walls of living crystal that pulsed with inner light. Representatives from across the Empire had gathered to witness the proceedings: crystalline Zephyrian nobles, the insectoid Zektar delegation, silicon-based Kovari merchants, and dozens of other species that had found prosperity under Imperial rule. At the center of the chamber stood an altar carved from a single massive gem, its surface reflecting the assembled crowd in prismatic fragments. And, standing beside the altar, looking remarkably composed for someone about to marry into the most powerful family in the galaxy, was Marcus Chen. Zarathul paused at the chamber entrance, studying him with the analytical gaze of a battlefield commander. He was exactly as described, shorter than any adult in the room, his brown hair neatly arranged, wearing what she recognized as formal human diplomatic attire. His skin had that peculiar softness that marked all mammals, and she could see the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed the specially modified atmosphere. But there was something else, something the intelligence reports had failed to capture. As Marcus Chen turned to meet her gaze across the ceremonial chamber, Zarathul saw an expression in his brown eyes that she had not expected. He was not afraid. More than that, as he nodded respectfully in her direction, she detected something that made her pause. There was an alertness to his posture, a careful attention to his surroundings that reminded her of veteran soldiers. His hands rested calmly at his sides, but she noticed how his feet were positioned for quick movement, how his shoulders held the subtle tension of someone prepared to react to threat. It was probably nothing. Humans were naturally paranoid, and any intelligent being would be nervous in such circumstances. But, as Zarathul began her formal procession down the aisle toward the altar, she found herself reassessing her first impression of the man she was about to marry. Marcus Chen watched her approach with steady eyes, and, for the first time since this entire arrangement had been proposed, Zarathul felt something she rarely experienced: curiosity. The ceremony itself was conducted in the ancient language of the Empire, with each word carefully chosen to emphasize the political nature of the union. As Zarathul spoke her vows, promising to honor the alliance between their species and to guide humanity toward its proper place in the galactic order, she kept studying Marcus Chen's reactions. He responded to each ritual element with appropriate formality, his pronunciation of the Zephyrian phrases remarkably accurate for someone who had only had weeks to learn the language. His voice was steady, showing none of the trembling that usually accompanied alien nervousness. When the ceremonial blade was offered for the blood-binding ritual, he did not hesitate to make the required cut across his palm, though she noticed he chose the precise location to minimize nerve damage while ensuring adequate blood flow. That was interesting. When the ceremony concluded and the assembled dignitaries began the traditional celebration feast, Marcus Chen approached her with the same calm composure he had shown throughout the proceedings. "Your Excellency," he said, using the formal address with perfect pronunciation. "I want to thank you for accepting this arrangement. I understand the significance of what we've accomplished here today." Zarathul tilted her head slightly, studying his expression. "You speak as though this were your idea, Marcus Chen." "Please, just Marcus." "And, no, not my idea. But, I understand why it was necessary." He paused, glancing around at the crystalline architecture surrounding them. "Your people value strength above all else. This marriage demonstrates that humanity is willing to acknowledge Zephyrian superiority in exchange for protection and technological advancement." It was exactly the right thing to say, the response that every Zephyrian noble would want to hear. So why did Zarathul have the impression that there were layers of meaning beneath his words that she was not quite grasping? "You seem remarkably calm for someone who has just married into an alien species," she observed. Marcus smiled, and, for a moment, his diplomatic composure slipped enough to show genuine warmth. "I've spent my career preparing for situations exactly like this. Humanity has always survived by adapting to new environments and learning from stronger neighbors. This is just a more personal version of that process." Before Zarathul could respond, her father approached, his massive frame casting a shadow over both of them. General Kethvar stood nearly 9 feet tall, his crystalline skin bearing the deep purple hue that marked him as a member of the warrior caste. The scars covering his arms and face told the story of 100 battles, and his reputation as the world-breaker was known throughout the galaxy. "So this is our human ally," the general said, his voice carrying the low rumble that made most beings instinctively step backward. Marcus Chen did not step backward. Instead, he offered a respectful bow and said, "General Kethvar." It's an honor to meet the architect of the Empire's expansion into the outer spiral arms. The general's purple eyes narrowed slightly. You know of my campaigns? I've studied every major military engagement of the past century. Your breakthrough at the siege of HFY Prime was particularly impressive. Using crystal resonance to shatter their planetary shield grid from the inside was brilliant tactical thinking. Zarathul watched her father's expression shift from mild interest to genuine surprise. Military history was not typically something diplomats studied in such detail, and the specific battle Marcus had referenced was not widely known outside of imperial military circles. Indeed, the general said slowly. And what did you think of the Draconi campaign? A masterpiece of psychological warfare, Marcus replied without hesitation. Convincing 3 separate Draconi fleet admirals that their allies had betrayed them turned a potentially costly siege into a 3-way civil war. Though I imagine the intelligence work required to make that deception believable must have been extraordinary. Now Zarathul was certain there was more to this human than the intelligence reports had suggested. The level of detail he was discussing required access to classified imperial military records, or a depth of strategic analysis that went far beyond diplomatic training. As the celebration continued around them, she found herself engaging in conversation with Marcus about topics ranging from xenobiology to interstellar economics. With each exchange, she became more convinced that Earth's diplomatic corps had sent someone far more capable than anyone had expected. It was only later, as the formal ceremonies concluded and the couple was escorted to Zarathul's private chambers for the traditional first night of marriage, that she began to wonder if perhaps the intelligence reports had been wrong about more than just Marcus Chen's intellectual capabilities. Standing in her chambers as the guards sealed the doors behind them, Zarathul looked at her new husband and realized that for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to expect next. Marcus Chen smiled at her again, that same warm expression that seemed to carry hidden depths, and said quietly, "Well, I suppose we should talk about what happens now." And, in that moment, Zarathul began to suspect that this marriage might not proceed quite the way the Empire had planned. The private chambers of the Imperial Spire were designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Crystalline walls rose 20 feet overhead, their surfaces embedded with bioluminescent organisms that provided a soft, blue-white glow. Ancient weapons from conquered civilizations hung in carefully arranged displays, each piece representing another world that had learned to kneel before Zephyrian superiority. The furniture was carved from rare minerals that could only be found in the cores of dead stars, and the view from the massive windows showed the entire capital city sprawling beneath the twin suns. Marcus Chen walked slowly around the chamber, his hands clasped behind his back as he examined the collection of artifacts with what appeared to be genuine interest. Zarathul remained near the sealed entrance, watching him with the careful attention of a predator studying unfamiliar prey. "This is a Corvin plasma blade, isn't it?" Marcus asked, pausing before one of the displays. "Late period, probably 3rd dynasty judging by the quantum stabilization matrix." Zarathul felt her crystalline skin shift slightly, a physiological response to surprise that she quickly suppressed. Most beings cannot identify Corvin craftsmanship, especially humans. Your species has had minimal contact with the Corvin hegemony. Marcus turned to face her, and, once again she noticed that steady gaze that seemed to see more than it should. Diplomatic preparation is thorough. When you're representing your entire species in negotiations, you learn to recognize the cultural artifacts of every major galactic power. And, yet Earth's diplomatic files list you as having no xenoarchaeological training. Earth's diplomatic files contain exactly what we wanted them to contain, Marcus said quietly. The statement hung in the air between them like a challenge. Zarathul moved away from the door, her movements carrying the fluid grace of a trained warrior, and positioned herself where she could see both Marcus and the room's security sensors. "Explain," she said. Marcus smiled, but this time there was something different about the expression. The diplomatic warmth was still there, but, beneath it, Zarathul detected something harder. Something that reminded her of the expression worn by veteran soldiers who had seen real combat. "The marriage proposal came through official imperial channels 8 months ago," Marcus said, settling into one of the mineral chairs with casual ease. "A simple arrangement, one human diplomat wed to Zephyrian nobility in exchange for Earth's peaceful integration into the Empire. Very generous terms, considering your people's usual approach to expansion." The Empire recognizes that voluntary cooperation is more efficient than forced subjugation, Zarathul replied, using the standard diplomatic phrasing. Of course. Much easier to govern a willing population than a resistant one. And humans have always been adaptable. We tend to survive by learning from our superiors and adopting their methods. Marcus paused, his brown eyes meeting her purple ones directly. The question is, which one of us is actually learning from the other? Zarathul felt a familiar sensation, a heightened alertness that came when an enemy revealed unexpected capabilities in the middle of what should have been a routine engagement. Her muscles tensed automatically, combat instincts honed over decades of warfare responding to some subtle threat she couldn't yet identify. You speak in riddles, husband. Do I? Let me be more direct then. Marcus stood up, his movements displaying that same careful balance she had noticed during the ceremony. Your intelligence services spent considerable effort analyzing Earth's capabilities. They cataloged our technology, assessed our military strength, evaluated our social structures. Very thorough work, actually. But they made one critical error in their assessment. Which was? They assumed that what they could see represented everything we had to offer. Zarathul's hand moved instinctively toward the ceremonial blade at her hip, though she stopped the motion before completing it. Marcus noticed the gesture and nodded approvingly. Good reflexes. But you won't need the weapon, Zarathul. I'm not here to harm you or your people. I'm here to prevent a war that would cost both our species more than either can afford. War? Zarathul's voice carried the sharp edge of command authority. Earth lacks the military capacity to threaten the Empire. Your most advanced warships couldn't penetrate a single Imperial patrol vessel. You're absolutely right, Marcus agreed readily. In a direct military confrontation, humanity would be annihilated. Our ships are slower, our weapons are weaker, our soldiers are physically inferior. By every conventional metric, we pose no threat to Zephyrian supremacy. Then, why speak of war? Marcus walked to one of the massive windows, gazing out at the crystalline towers of the capital city. Tell me, Zarathul, what do you know about human history? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Zarathul had learned to be wary of apparent non-sequiturs in tactical discussions. Your species evolved on a single world, achieved technological civilization approximately 10,000 years ago, developed interstellar travel within the last century. Standard xenobiological development pattern for carbon-based intelligence. That's the broad overview, yes. But the details are more interesting. Humans spent most of their history fighting each other. Not just occasional conflicts over resources, but constant, brutal warfare spanning millennia. We developed more ways to kill members of our own species than most civilizations developed to hunt prey. Zarathul frowned. Internecine conflict is common among developing species. It usually ends when they achieve sufficient technological advancement to recognize the inefficiency of internal warfare. Usually, yes. But humans took it to extremes that most species find difficult to comprehend. We fought wars that lasted generations. We developed weapons capable of sterilizing our entire planet. We created military strategies based on the complete destruction of enemy populations. Marcus turned back to face her. And then, we learned something that changed everything. Which was how to survive when survival should be impossible. How to keep fighting when every rational analysis says you should surrender. How to turn desperate situations into tactical advantages. Marcus's expression had grown more serious, the diplomatic mask slipping to reveal something that made Zarathul's combat instincts scream warnings. How to make enemies regret ever threatening the things we care about. The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of the bioluminescent wall organisms. Zarathul found herself reassessing everything about this conversation, about Marcus himself, about the intelligence reports that had described humans as emotionally unstable and strategically predictable. You're suggesting that Earth's surrender to imperial authority was not genuine, she said carefully. I'm suggesting that humans don't surrender. Not really. We adapt, we negotiate, we make strategic retreats when necessary. But we never ever stop planning for the moment when we can strike back. Strike back with what? Zarathal's voice carried genuine curiosity now rather than skepticism. Your technology cannot threaten our defenses. Your military cannot challenge our fleets. Your people cannot match our physical capabilities. Marcus smiled again, and, this time the expression was genuinely terrifying in its implications. Zarathal, your people conquered dozens of species by overwhelming them with superior force. You studied their technology, defeated their armies, occupied their worlds. But, you never learned the most important lesson about warfare that humans discovered through 10,000 years of fighting each other. Enlighten me. The strongest enemy isn't always the one who wins. Before Zarathal could respond to that cryptic statement, Marcus continued. 3 weeks ago, a human cargo freighter suffered a navigation malfunction near the Proxima defense station. Imperial patrol vessels responded immediately, as required by standard safety protocols. They rescued the crew, provided medical assistance, and helped repair the ship's systems. Very humanitarian response, exactly what you'd expect from a civilized galactic power. Standard procedure for dealing with disabled vessels in Imperial space, Zarathal confirmed, though she was beginning to suspect where this was leading. Of course. What your people didn't realize was that the navigation malfunction was deliberate. While your crews were helping repair the freighter's systems, human engineers were installing monitoring devices throughout the patrol vessels. Quantum encrypted sensors so small they're virtually undetectable, capable of recording everything from structural schematics to communication protocols. Zarathal felt her crystalline skin shift color, an involuntary stress response that indicated how seriously she was taking this revelation. That's impossible. Imperial ships undergo regular security sweeps. Any unauthorized technology would be detected immediately. Would it? The devices were grown rather than manufactured, using biomimetic technology that registers as organic matter to most scanning systems. They look like harmless bacteria to standard Imperial sensors. Marcus's tone remained conversational, but his words were hammering home implications that made Zarathal's tactical mind race through possibilities. Even if such devices exist, the information they could gather would be limited. Patrol vessel specifications are hardly critical strategic intelligence. You're right. Patrol vessels aren't particularly important. But patrol vessels dock at Imperial naval facilities. They undergo maintenance at Imperial shipyards. They communicate with Imperial command structures. Marcus paused, letting the implications sink in. And, once you have access to Imperial naval communications, you can track fleet movements, identify supply lines, and map the entire defensive network of the Empire. The room seemed to grow colder, despite the constant temperature maintained by the environmental systems. Zarathal found herself calculating response times, security protocols, the potential scope of an intelligence breach of the magnitude Marcus was describing. You're claiming that Earth has compromised Imperial naval security, she said slowly. I'm claiming that humans are very good at finding ways to survive when survival seems impossible. And, we're especially good at gathering the intelligence we need to turn desperate situations to our advantage. Zarathal moved closer to Marcus, her height advantage allowing her to look down at him with the full intimidation value of her physical presence. If what you're saying is true, then, this marriage is not about peaceful integration. It's about espionage. Marcus met her gaze without flinching, his brown eyes steady despite being confronted by a being who could literally crush his skull with her bare hands. This marriage is about preventing a catastrophe that neither of our species would survive intact, he said quietly. Because the intelligence we've gathered reveals something that your military leadership hasn't told you. Which is? The Empire is not as strong as it appears. Your expansion has outpaced your ability to maintain control. You have supply line vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Command structure weaknesses that could be targeted. And, most importantly, you have populations on dozens of conquered worlds who are waiting for any sign that Imperial power might be challenged. Zarathal stepped back, her mind racing through tactical assessments and strategic implications. If Marcus was telling the truth, then, humanity had done something that no species in galactic history had managed. They had found a way to threaten Imperial dominance without possessing superior technology or military strength. You're describing the potential for insurrection across multiple systems, she said. I'm describing what happens when an empire expands too fast and assumes that fear alone will maintain control indefinitely. Marcus's voice carried a weight of conviction that suggested he had thought through every aspect of what he was discussing. Humans learned a long time ago that the most powerful military force in the world can still be brought down if enough people decide they're willing to die to make it happen. And, you believe Earth could coordinate such resistance movements? I believe that humans are uniquely qualified to teach other species how to fight enemies that seem impossible to defeat. We've had a lot of practice. The implications of what Marcus was suggesting hit Zarathal like a physical blow. Not just the potential for rebellion on individual worlds, but the possibility of coordinated resistance across multiple systems, guided by human strategic expertise and supplied with intelligence gathered from compromised Imperial communications. It would not be a conventional war that the Empire could win through superior firepower. It would be a nightmare of guerrilla conflicts, sabotage operations, and coordinated strikes against the most vulnerable points of an extended supply chain. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I don't want it to happen, Marcus replied simply. Because despite what your people believe about human emotional instability, we're actually very good at long-term strategic planning. And, because I think you're intelligent enough to realize that there might be a better solution than the one your father's generation has chosen. Zarathal stared at him for a long moment, reassessing everything she thought she knew about humans, about this marriage, about the political situation that had led to this moment. What kind of solution? Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since entering her chambers, the expression seemed entirely genuine. The kind that lets both our species survive and prosper without either one having to kneel to the other. But, it's going to require us to trust each other in ways that neither of our peoples is prepared for. And, as Zarathal looked into the brown eyes of the human she had married only hours earlier, she realized that her life had just become far more complicated than she had ever imagined possible. The next 3 weeks established a routine that neither Zarathal nor Marcus had anticipated when their political marriage began. Each morning, Marcus would join her for combat training in the Imperial Spire's advanced gymnasium, a crystalline chamber equipped with gravity manipulators and holographic opponents that could simulate warriors from across the galaxy. Initially, Zarathal had expected to demonstrate the vast physical superiority that Zephyrians held over humans. Instead, she found herself learning things about warfare that her decades of military training had never taught her. Your people fight like you're trying to prove something, Marcus observed on their 15th morning together, dodging a practice strike that would have shattered human bones if it had connected. His movements were impossibly fluid, turning Zarathal's superior speed and strength into disadvantages by making her overcommit to attacks that struck nothing but air. We fight to win, Zarathal replied, spinning with crystalline grace to intercept what should have been an impossible counterattack. Marcus had already moved, flowing around her guard like water, finding the path of least resistance. No, you fight to dominate. There's a difference. Marcus's voice remained calm despite the brutal pace of their sparring match. Domination requires your opponent to acknowledge your superiority. Winning just requires your opponent to stop fighting. Zarathal paused, her warrior instincts screaming warnings about dropping her guard, but her tactical mind was too intrigued by the distinction Marcus had drawn to maintain focus on the combat drill. Explain. Marcus straightened from his defensive crouch, his human form looking absurdly fragile next to her crystalline perfection. Every battle you've ever fought, you've won by proving that Zephyrian strength was superior to whatever your enemies could bring to bear. You overwhelmed their defenses, crushed their resistance, and forced them to admit defeat. It's an effective strategy when you're stronger than your opponents. And when you're not. When you're not stronger, you don't try to prove anything. You just make the other side regret ever starting the fight in the first place. That afternoon, Marcus introduced her to human military history through a series of holographic recreations that he claimed were accurate depictions of actual battles from Earth's past. Zarathal found herself studying conflicts between forces so primitively equipped that their weapons would have been toys compared to modern Imperial armaments, yet the strategic principles being demonstrated were sophisticated beyond anything she had encountered in official Imperial tactical doctrine. This is the Battle of Thermopylae, Marcus explained as they watched 300 human warriors face an army of hundreds of thousands. The Greeks knew they couldn't win. Everyone knew they couldn't win. But they fought anyway, because sometimes the point isn't to survive. Sometimes the point is to make sure the cost of victory is too high for your enemy to bear. Zarathul watched the holographic recreation with growing fascination. The tactical situation was hopeless by any rational analysis, yet the smaller force had chosen ground that maximized their defensive advantages and minimized their enemy's numerical superiority. More importantly, they had fought with a ferocity that seemed to transcend logical calculation. They all died, she observed. Yes. But their deaths inspired resistance movements across the entire Greek peninsula. The Persian Empire won the battle and lost the war because they discovered that conquering people who refuse to stay conquered is ultimately impossible. The Persians had overwhelming technological and numerical advantages, Zarathul pointed out. By every logical standard, their victory should have led to permanent control of the region. Should have, yes. But humans aren't particularly logical when it comes to survival. We're emotional, remember? We make irrational decisions based on concepts like honor and loyalty and protecting the people we care about. Marcus paused the holographic display, freezing the moment when the last Greek warriors fell beneath a storm of Persian arrows. Your intelligence reports were right about that part. We are emotionally driven. What they got wrong was thinking that makes us weak. That evening, as they shared the formal dinner that protocol required of newly married imperial couples, Marcus began teaching Zarathul about human intelligence gathering techniques. Not the sophisticated electronic surveillance that had compromised imperial naval communications, but the ancient art of reading people, understanding motivations, and predicting behavior based on psychological analysis. Your father is planning something beyond the standard integration of Earth into the Empire, Marcus said between courses, his tone conversational enough that anyone monitoring their conversations would assume he was making small talk. Zarathul set down her crystal eating utensil with careful precision. What makes you think that? The security briefings he's been receiving from Imperial intelligence have increased in frequency over the past week. The subjects being discussed aren't related to Earth or human capabilities. And, this morning, he met with Admiral Zefkor, who commands the 4th Battle Fleet. How could you possibly know about my father's private meetings? Marcus smiled, that same expression that had begun to signal something much more complex than simple diplomatic courtesy. Because humans learned a long time ago that if you pay attention to the right details, people tell you far more than they realize. Your father's aide, Veltar, has been showing signs of increased stress. His sleep patterns have changed, his nutrition intake has decreased, and his posture indicates someone carrying psychological pressure beyond normal operational parameters. Zarathul stared at him. You diagnosed stress patterns in a Zephyrian you've met twice. Stress is universal among intelligent species. The physiological responses vary, but the underlying patterns are consistent. Veltar is worried about something that goes beyond routine military planning. Marcus paused, studying her expression with those disconcertingly perceptive brown eyes. And so are you. The truth was that Zarathul had been increasingly concerned about her father's recent behavior. General Kethvar had been conducting meetings with senior imperial military leaders that went beyond anything required for Earth's integration. Fleet movements were being discussed that seemed excessive for maintaining security around a single primitive world. And, most disturbing, resources were being allocated for what appeared to be preparation for a major military campaign. Suppose you're correct, Zarathul said carefully. What do you think he's planning? I think your father believes that this marriage has served its purpose as a political distraction, and he's preparing to take more direct action regarding Earth. Marcus's voice remained calm, but Zarathul could see the tension in his shoulders. I think he's planning to invade. The possibility had occurred to Zarathul as well, though she had hoped her suspicions were wrong. A military invasion of Earth would make no strategic sense given the resources already committed to peaceful integration, unless her father had concluded that the marriage arrangement was not proceeding as anticipated. Why would he do that? Earth has offered no resistance to imperial authority. Because someone has convinced him that Earth represents a greater threat than originally assessed. And, I suspect that someone has been feeding him intelligence about human capabilities that goes beyond what your standard reconnaissance gathered. Zarathul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's environmental controls. You think there's been a breach in human security? I think your father knows more about Earth's actual defensive capabilities than he should. And I think he's concluded that the marriage arrangement was a mistake that needs to be corrected through more traditional imperial methods. They finished dinner in thoughtful silence, each considering the implications of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond the control of either participant. As the evening protocols concluded and they prepared for sleep, Zarathul found herself facing a decision that would have seemed impossible when this arrangement began. Marcus, she said as he prepared to retire to the secondary chamber that had been designated as his quarters. Yes? If my father is planning to attack Earth, what would humanity's response be? Marcus turned to face her, and, in his expression she saw something that made her crystalline skin shift involuntarily. It was not fear, not desperation, not even anger. It was the cold calculation of someone who had already considered every possible contingency and made the necessary preparations. Zarathul, if the Imperial military attacks Earth, humanity will do what we've always done when faced with impossible odds. Which is, we'll make sure that everyone who survives learns why that was the worst mistake they ever made. The next morning brought confirmation of Zarathul's worst fears. Her father summoned her to his private command chamber, a crystalline cathedral dedicated to military planning where holographic displays showed the current disposition of Imperial forces across the galaxy. Admiral Zefkor was present, along with 3 other senior fleet commanders, and the tactical display showed a concentration of naval power that could only mean one thing. My daughter, General Kethvar said without preamble, your marriage has provided excellent intelligence about human psychology and social structures. However, our analysis indicates that Earth's integration cannot be completed through diplomatic means alone. Zarathul kept her expression neutral, though internally she was calculating the size of the force being assembled. What analysis, father? Intelligence reports indicate that the human government has been using the marriage negotiations to buy time for military preparations. They have been secretly fortifying their home system and developing weapons technologies that could threaten Imperial interests. Admiral Zefkor activated one of the holographic displays, showing what appeared to be sensor readings from the Sol system. Long-range reconnaissance has detected energy signatures consistent with mass driver installations and gravitational manipulation devices. The humans are attempting to turn their home system into a fortress. Zarathul studied the data, her tactical training automatically analyzing the defensive positions and weapons placements. The fortifications were substantial, though they would pose no serious threat to a full Imperial battle fleet. But something about the configurations seemed familiar, as if she had seen similar defensive arrangements before. This intelligence comes from human sources, she asked. Intercepted communications and remote sensor data, her father replied. The evidence is conclusive. Earth has been preparing for war while pretending to negotiate for peace. As Zarathul continued studying the displays, she began to understand what she was really looking at. The defensive positions were real, but their configuration was wrong for serious military resistance. They were positioned to maximize the appearance of defensive capability while minimizing actual strategic value. More importantly, they were designed to be obviously detectable by the long-range reconnaissance systems that the Empire typically used for threat assessment. When do you plan to move against Earth? She asked. The 4th Battle Fleet will depart in 72 hours, Admiral Zefkor announced. We will demand immediate surrender. If the humans refuse, we will demonstrate the consequences of betraying Imperial trust. Zarathul nodded as if she approved of the plan, though her mind was racing through implications that her father and his advisors apparently had not considered. If Marcus was right about human strategic thinking, then the defensive installations they were seeing were not preparations for resistance. They were bait, designed to provoke exactly the response that the Imperial military was planning. But, bait for what? I request permission to accompany the fleet, she said. General Kethvar's expression showed surprise. That is unnecessary, daughter. This will be a simple demonstration of Imperial power. Earth will surrender within hours of our arrival. Nevertheless, I believe my presence might facilitate negotiations. The humans may be more willing to surrender if they see that their diplomatic representative's wife supports Imperial authority. After a moment's consideration, her father nodded approval. Very well. You will accompany Admiral Zefkor aboard the flagship. Perhaps the sight of overwhelming Imperial force will help your husband understand the futility of human resistance. As the meeting concluded and the military commanders dispersed to their final preparations, Zarathul found herself wondering whether she was making the right choice. In 72 hours, the most powerful military force in the galaxy would arrive at Earth expecting to face primitive defensive installations and frightened human populations. Based on what Marcus had taught her about human strategic thinking, she was beginning to suspect that the Imperial fleet was sailing into something far more complex than a simple demonstration of superior firepower. And she was no longer certain which side was actually setting the trap. The Imperial flagship Worldbreaker was a cathedral of crystalline engineering that stretched nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern. Its biometal hull could withstand the gravitational stress of black hole proximity, and its quantum fusion arsenal could sterilize planetary surfaces from orbital distance. As Zarathul stood on the command deck beside Admiral Zefkor, watching the starfield shift through hyperspace toward the Sol system, she reflected on the fact that she was aboard the most destructive weapon ever created by Zephyrian science. Behind them followed the entire 4th Battle Fleet, 12 dreadnoughts, 36 heavy cruisers, and more than 200 support vessels carrying enough firepower to conquer most civilizations single-handedly. It was a demonstration of Imperial might that should have terrified any rational enemy into immediate surrender. The problem was that Marcus had taught her to think differently about what constituted rational behavior. "Transition to normal space in 30 minutes, announced the flagship's tactical officer, a crystalline giant whose purple skin bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. All vessels report ready for immediate combat deployment." Admiral Zefkor turned to Zarathul with the confident smile of a predator approaching cornered prey. "Your husband will have an excellent view of Imperial power from his homeworld. Perhaps this will help him appreciate the futility of human resistance." Zarathul nodded appropriately, though her attention was focused on the sensor readings beginning to stream across the command displays. As the fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, long-range scanners immediately began cataloging the defensive installations that had prompted this military response. The fortifications were exactly as the intelligence reports had described. Mass driver platforms positioned at the system's outer perimeter, gravitational manipulation stations that could theoretically disrupt incoming ships, and what appeared to be missile launch facilities scattered across multiple planets and asteroids. To Imperial tactical analysis, it looked like humanity had spent the past months frantically preparing for the war they knew was coming. Impressive for such a primitive species, Admiral Zefkor observed with mild amusement. They actually believed these installations could threaten Imperial vessels. Zarathul studied the defensive configurations more carefully, applying the tactical principles Marcus had been teaching her. The positions were competently designed and would pose a serious threat to any force that attempted a conventional frontal assault. But they were also positioned in ways that seemed to invite specific attack patterns, as if the defenders wanted their enemies to approach from particular directions. "Admiral," she said carefully, "have we received any communication from Earth's government regarding our arrival?" "Not yet. They are probably paralyzed by terror, trying to decide whether to surrender immediately or make some futile gesture of defiance." The Admiral activated the fleet's communication systems. "This is Admiral Zefkor of the Imperial 4th Battle Fleet, addressing the human government of Earth. You have been found in violation of Imperial integration accords through illegal military preparations and deceptive negotiation practices. You have 1 hour to surrender unconditionally, or we will demonstrate the consequences of betraying Imperial trust." The response came faster than anyone on the command deck had expected. "Admiral Zefkor, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Coalition. We acknowledge your arrival and your demands. However, we believe there may have been some misunderstanding regarding our defensive preparations. Would you be willing to discuss this matter before taking military action?" Zarathul felt something cold settle in her stomach. Admiral Chen. Marcus never mentioned having relatives in Earth's military. Admiral Zefkor's expression showed mild interest. Probably a coincidence. Chen appears to be a common human designation. He activated the communication array again. "Admiral Chen, there is no misunderstanding. Imperial intelligence has confirmed that Earth has been preparing for military resistance while pretending to negotiate in good faith. Surrender immediately, or face the consequences of your deception." I understand your position, Admiral Zefkor. However, I believe your intelligence may be incomplete. Our defensive installations were constructed with Imperial knowledge and approval, as part of the standard security protocols for newly integrated systems. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to review the relevant documentation? Admiral Zefkor's confident expression faltered slightly. Zarathal moved closer to the command displays, studying the tactical readouts with increasing unease. What security protocols? The Admiral demanded. Standard Imperial Regulation 847C requires newly integrated systems to maintain defensive capabilities sufficient to deter non-Imperial threats while awaiting full incorporation into Imperial defense networks. Our installations were designed according to specifications provided by Imperial engineering consultants. There was a long silence on the command deck as Admiral Zefkor and his staff exchanged uncertain glances. Zarathal accessed the Imperial legal database through her command authorization and felt her unease transform into genuine alarm. Imperial Regulation 847C did exist. It had been established decades earlier to prevent newly integrated systems from falling victim to pirate raids or opportunistic attacks from rival galactic powers. Under the regulation, Earth not only had the right to construct defensive installations, it was actually required to do so. Admiral, Zarathal said quietly, I recommend we pause military operations and review this matter with Imperial Command before proceeding. But Admiral Zefkor was already committed to his course of action. Regulations or not, these installations exceed reasonable defensive parameters. The humans are using legal technicalities to disguise military preparation. He turned to his tactical officer. Begin the assault. Target the outer perimeter installations first. As the Imperial fleet moved into attack formation, Zarathal watched the human defensive positions with growing comprehension of what she was actually seeing. The installations were not randomly positioned or desperately improvised. They were components of a carefully designed tactical system that was about to demonstrate capabilities no one on the Imperial command deck had anticipated. The first Imperial attack wave consisted of 36 heavy cruisers, more than enough firepower to obliterate the outer defensive ring. As they approached the human positions, the gravity manipulation stations activated, creating distortion fields that pulled the attacking ships off course and into overlapping fields of fire from the mass driver platforms. 3 Imperial cruisers were destroyed in the first exchange, their biometal hulls shattered by kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. The surviving ships adapted quickly, using their superior maneuverability to avoid the gravity traps and close to effective weapons range. That was when the human positions revealed their secondary capabilities. Admiral, the tactical officer called out in alarm. The human installations are launching some kind of projectiles, but they're not targeting our ships. On the main display, streams of small objects were erupting from concealed launch points across the inner system. At first glance, they appeared to be standard missiles or interceptor drones. But, as the Imperial fleet's sensors analyzed their trajectories, it became clear that they were not heading for any Imperial vessel. Instead, they were spreading throughout the system in a complex three-dimensional pattern that seemed designed to create some kind of detection network. What are they doing? Admiral Zefkor demanded. Before anyone could answer, the true nature of the human strategy became clear. The small objects were not weapons at all. They were sensor platforms, equipped with quantum-encrypted communication links and equipped with detailed information about Imperial ship designs, weapons capabilities, and tactical doctrine. Information that could only have come from the monitoring devices Marcus had mentioned were installed aboard Imperial patrol vessels months earlier. They know everything about our ships, Zarathal said, her voice barely above a whisper. They know our weapons ranges, our shield frequencies, our maneuvering capabilities. As if to confirm her assessment, the human defensive positions opened fire with precisely targeted barrages that exploited the specific vulnerabilities of each Imperial ship class. Quantum torpedoes struck at the exact shield resonance frequencies that would cause cascading failures. Mass driver rounds impacted at structural weak points that only detailed engineering analysis could have identified. Energy beams focused on sensor arrays and communication nodes with surgical precision. The Imperial fleet found itself fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate every tactical decision before it was made. Human defensive fire concentrated on critical systems rather than attempting to destroy ships outright, systematically degrading Imperial combat effectiveness while minimizing their own defensive losses. How is this possible? Admiral Zefkor snarled, his confidence evaporating as the tactical display showed Imperial forces taking casualties against an enemy that should have been obliterated in the first exchange. Because we've been fighting this battle for months, came a new voice over the communication array. This is Marcus Chen, diplomatic liaison and tactical consultant to the Earth Defense Coalition. Hello, Zarathul. I hope you're beginning to understand what I meant about human strategic planning. The command deck fell silent except for the alerts from damaged Imperial vessels. Zarathul stared at the communication display, finally, comprehending the full scope of what her husband had accomplished. You orchestrated all of this, she said. The marriage, the intelligence gathering, even provoking this attack. The marriage was real, Zarathul. Everything else was just making sure that when this moment came, humanity would be ready for it. Marcus's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had planned for every contingency. Admiral Zefkor, I'm transmitting tactical analysis data to your flagship. You'll see that your current position is untenable. We have detailed intelligence on every ship in your fleet, and our defensive positions are designed specifically to counter Imperial tactical doctrine. Admiral Zefkor's expression had transformed from confident predator to uncertain prey. You cannot defeat the Imperial fleet with primitive technology. We're not trying to defeat you, Admiral. We're demonstrating why attacking Earth is the worst strategic decision the Empire could possibly make. Marcus paused, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried implications that made Zarathul's crystalline skin shift color involuntarily. Because this defensive system isn't just protecting Earth. It's a proof of concept. And every species in the galaxy that's currently under Imperial control is watching to see what happens next. On the tactical displays, new contacts were beginning to appear at the edge of the sensor range. Ships that bore the configurations of a dozen different species, all of them supposedly loyal Imperial member worlds. Ships that were maintaining course toward the Sol system despite having no official authorization to be there. You see, Admiral, humans learned something important during our history of constant warfare. The most effective way to defeat a superior enemy is not to fight them directly. It's to teach everyone else how to fight them effectively. And, then, make sure everyone else knows that victory is possible. As the implications of Marcus's words sank in, Zarathul realized that the Imperial fleet had not sailed into a simple demonstration of superior firepower. They had walked into the opening engagement of the first coordinated rebellion in Imperial history, guided by human strategic expertise and supplied with intelligence that would allow inferior forces to fight superior ones on equal terms. And, as she watched more ships appear on the sensors, representing species from across the galaxy who had apparently decided that Imperial domination was no longer inevitable, Zarathul began to understand why Marcus had warned her that this marriage would require them to trust each other in ways neither of their species was prepared for. Because the galaxy was about to change, and the couple at the center of an interstellar political arrangement had become the focal point of a revolution that neither the Empire nor humanity could control, the command deck of the Worldbreaker had become a tableau of crystalline stillness as Admiral Zefkor and his staff processed the tactical nightmare unfolding around them. What had begun as a routine demonstration of Imperial superiority had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history, a coordinated challenge to Imperial authority by dozens of supposedly subjugated species. Zarathul moved through the frozen scene like a predator stalking through a crystal garden, her military mind automatically cataloging the disaster developing around the 4th Battle Fleet. The tactical display showed Imperial ships taking systematic damage from defensive positions that seemed to anticipate every countermeasure. Worse, the sensor arrays were tracking more than 300 vessels from across the galaxy, all converging on the Sol system with obvious hostile intent. Admiral, she said quietly, I recommend immediate withdrawal to Imperial space. Admiral Zefkor turned to face her, his purple eyes burning with the fury of a predator that had discovered it was actually prey. We do not retreat from primitive species, regardless of their apparent preparation. This is not a primitive species, Admiral. And, this is not a battle we can win through conventional tactics. Zarathul gestured toward the displays showing the approaching rebel fleet. We are facing coordinated resistance by multiple species with detailed knowledge of our capabilities. Continuing this engagement will result in the destruction of the entire 4th Battle Fleet. Before the Admiral could respond, Marcus's voice filled the command deck again, carrying an authority that seemed to resonate through the crystalline architecture of the flagship itself. Zarathal is correct, Admiral Zefkor. Your current tactical position is hopeless. But withdrawal is also not an option, because this engagement was never about military victory. It was about sending a message that will be heard across the entire galaxy. Admiral Zefkor activated the communication array with violent precision. Human, your species has made the greatest mistake in its brief existence. When we return with the full Imperial Armada, your pathetic world will be reduced to cosmic debris. Admiral, if you return to Zephyr Prime and report this engagement accurately, the Imperial High Command will execute you for incompetence. If you lie about what happened here, you'll be condemning the Empire to repeat your mistakes on an even larger scale. Marcus paused, and, when he continued, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. And, if you somehow convince the High Command to send the full Armada to Earth, you'll discover why humans chose this particular moment to reveal our actual capabilities. Through the command deck's massive crystalline viewports, the assembled rebel fleet was becoming visible without magnification. Ships from the Corvan hegemony, vessels bearing Draconian military configurations, even the distinctive bioships of the Nexian Collective. Species that had fought each other for millennia before Imperial conquest had brought them under unified control were now operating in perfect coordination against their former masters. How did you coordinate this? Zarathal asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The same way humans have always survived when survival seemed impossible, by making friends with people who have reasons to help us. Marcus's voice carried a warmth that seemed incongruous given the magnitude of what he had orchestrated. It turns out that most species don't actually enjoy being conquered. They just needed someone to show them that resistance was possible. On the tactical displays, the human defensive positions were maintaining their systematic degradation of Imperial combat capabilities while carefully avoiding actions that would force Admiral Zefkor to choose between retreat and total annihilation of his fleet. It was a delicate balance that required precise understanding of Imperial military psychology and the political implications of various levels of casualties. You studied our tactical doctrine in remarkable detail, Admiral Zefkor admitted grudgingly. We studied everything about your civilization, Admiral. Not just your military capabilities, but your political structures, your economic systems, your social hierarchies. Marcus's tone remained conversational despite the circumstances. Humans learned a long time ago that if you want to defeat an enemy, you need to understand them better than they understand themselves. As if to demonstrate the truth of that statement, the human defensive coordinator began transmitting detailed analyses of the Imperial fleet's current tactical weaknesses directly to the rebel ships approaching from across the galaxy. Real-time intelligence about shield modulations, weapons targeting systems, and command communication protocols flowed through encrypted channels that the Imperial fleet's electronic warfare specialists could detect but not intercept. They're teaching the rebel forces how to fight us, the flagship's communications officer reported with barely contained alarm. Of course they are, Zarathal said, her voice carrying the grim appreciation of a professional recognizing superior strategy. This was never about defending Earth. This was about creating a template for rebellion that could be applied throughout the Empire. The first elements of the rebel fleet reached engagement range and immediately demonstrated the effectiveness of human tactical instruction. Corvan ships that had been crushed by Imperial forces during their original conquest were now employing coordinated attack patterns that exploited specific vulnerabilities in Zephyrian shield technology. Draconi vessels were using their natural speed advantages in ways that Imperial tactical doctrine had never anticipated. Even the traditionally peaceful Nexians were deploying their bioships with a strategic sophistication that suggested months of careful preparation. Admiral, Zarathal said urgently, we need to withdraw immediately. This engagement will be studied by every military academy in Imperial space as an example of how superior forces can be defeated through intelligence and coordination. But Admiral Zefkor was trapped by the same psychological factors that Marcus had obviously calculated into his strategy. Imperial military doctrine emphasized the absolute importance of never showing weakness before inferior species. Retreat in the face of human resistance would be interpreted as admission that the Empire could be successfully challenged by any determined enemy. Signal the fleet to form defensive positions around the flagship, the admiral ordered. We will hold this position until Imperial reinforcements arrive. Admiral, Zarathal said desperately, there are no reinforcements coming. The High Command doesn't even know this engagement is taking place. Then, we will hold until they do. As the Imperial fleet moved into defensive formation, Zarathal realized that Admiral Zefkor had made exactly the decision that Marcus had anticipated he would make. Rather than accepting tactical defeat and withdrawing to fight another day, the Admiral was choosing to make a stand that would result in either glorious victory or spectacular destruction. From a human perspective, it was the perfect outcome. If the Imperial fleet somehow managed to defeat the coordinated rebel forces, they would be so damaged that they could pose no threat to Earth. If the rebels succeeded in destroying the Fourth Battle Fleet, they would provide proof to every species in the galaxy that Imperial forces could be defeated by coordinated resistance. Marcus, Zarathal said, activating her personal communication channel, Admiral Zefkor is not going to retreat. This is going to become a battle of annihilation. I know, Marcus replied softly. I'm sorry, Zarathal. I tried to design this scenario to minimize casualties on both sides, but Imperial military psychology made that impossible. You're apologizing for outmaneuvering the most powerful military force in the galaxy? I'm apologizing because people you've served with are about to die, and that was never what I wanted to happen. But sometimes the choice isn't between good outcomes and bad outcomes. Sometimes the choice is between bad outcomes and catastrophic ones. Through the viewports, the rebel fleet was spreading into attack formation with the fluid coordination of forces that had trained together for months rather than the chaotic aggregation of separate species that Imperial intelligence had always assumed would characterize any anti-Imperial coalition. The tactical displays showed more than 500 vessels representing every major species in the galaxy, all operating under unified command and equipped with detailed intelligence about Imperial capabilities. How many species are involved in this rebellion? Zarathal asked. All of them, Marcus replied simply. Every species that the Empire has conquered in the past 3 centuries. Every world that was forced to accept Imperial authority. Every population that was promised protection and received subjugation instead. The magnitude of what Marcus had accomplished hit Zarathal like a physical blow. Not just the coordination of multiple species, but the careful timing required to bring forces from across the galaxy to this specific location at this specific moment. The intelligence gathering that had provided detailed knowledge of Imperial capabilities. The strategic planning that had anticipated every possible Imperial response and prepared countermeasures accordingly. It was the most sophisticated military operation in galactic history, orchestrated by a species that Imperial intelligence had dismissed as technologically primitive and strategically predictable. Admiral Zefkor, Marcus's voice filled the command deck one final time. I'm transmitting final terms for the cessation of hostilities. Your fleet will withdraw to Imperial space immediately. In exchange, the rebel forces will allow your withdrawal without further engagement. You have 5 minutes to respond. Admiral Zefkor stared at the communication array for a long moment, his expression cycling through emotions that Zarathal had never seen in a senior Imperial officer: uncertainty, anger, fear, and, finally, a kind of desperate pride that she recognized as the psychological state that preceded catastrophically bad decisions. Transmit this message to the human forces, the Admiral said with crystalline determination. The Fourth Battle Fleet does not negotiate with inferior species. We will hold this position and destroy any force that approaches us. Long live the Empire. As Admiral Zefkor terminated the communication link, Zarathal felt something shift inside her crystalline chest that she had never experienced before, the sensation of being on the wrong side of a conflict that mattered more than personal survival. Admiral, she said quietly, I request permission to transfer to the human forces. The command deck fell silent except for the tactical alerts showing the rebel fleet moving into final attack positions. Every eye turned toward Zarathal, the daughter of the Empire's greatest general, the wife of the human who had orchestrated the greatest challenge to Imperial authority in galactic history. You would betray your own species? Admiral Zefkor asked. I would save it, Zarathal replied. Because this battle isn't going to end here, Admiral. This is just the beginning. And, when the Empire finally realizes that it's facing a galaxy-wide rebellion guided by human strategic expertise, someone is going to need to negotiate terms that allow both sides to survive. Without waiting for permission that she knew would not be granted, Zarathul walked toward the command deck's emergency transport bay, her crystalline form moving with the fluid grace of a predator who had finally identified the real prey. Behind her, Admiral Zefkor was ordering his fleet into battle formation for what would become known as the Battle of Sol, the engagement that proved to the galaxy that even the most powerful empires could be brought down by people who refused to accept that conquest was permanent. And, ahead of her, Marcus was waiting in a small transport vessel, ready to begin the most complex negotiation in galactic history: how to transform an interstellar war into an interstellar peace that would allow thousands of species to coexist without any single power dominating the rest. As Zarathul's transport approached the human vessel, she reflected on the fact that her marriage had indeed changed the course of galactic civilization, though not in any way that either species had originally anticipated. She was no longer the alien bride who had been expected to facilitate humanity's peaceful surrender to imperial authority. She had become something entirely new, the bridge between two civilizations that would have to learn to trust each other if either was going to survive what they had started together. And, as Marcus smiled at her through the transport's viewport, Zarathul realized that despite everything that had happened, despite all the strategic maneuvering and political manipulation, the most important thing about their marriage remained the simplest: they had chosen to trust each other when trust seemed impossible, and that choice had given both their species a chance at a future that neither conquest nor surrender could have provided. The galaxy would never be the same. But, perhaps, with careful negotiation and mutual respect for the strengths that each species brought to the table, it might become something better than either the Empire or humanity could have achieved alone.